So today I will introduce Julian to you. Today's guest speaker is playwright, director and producer Julian Hobba. Julian became the Executive Director of the State Theatre Company of South Australia in May last year, not even a full year. He's been involved in independent and professional theatre at Malthouse in Melbourne, the Aspian Island Theatre Co in Canberra, and he came to Adelaide after 3 years as the Executive Director at the Blue Room Theatre in Perth, a company dedicated to the development of new Australian plays. And I suspect that might be the way you go here as well, I'm not sure. He'd written his first play by the age of 21 and began production at the age of 25. In the ensuing years, Julian honed his producing, business and managerial skills. He now brings these skills to the State Theatre Company in these difficult COVID-19 times. Julian grew up in South Australia's Riverland region, then studied both at the University of Adelaide and as a journalism student at the UniSA. High praise. Robyn Archer AO described him as not only pragmatic and efficient but highly creative at the same time. His sensibilities are at the heart of theatre. Julian will now tell us how he has had to put these qualities into practice during his short, challenging time at the State Theatre Company. Thanks, Julian.
Thanks, Kay. Thank you, Kay. I hadn't anticipated the Robyn Archer endorsement was going to be read out. Always good. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'd also like to firstly acknowledge that I'm joining you here on Kaurna land and acknowledge traditional owners. The Kaurna people is the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains and their elders past, present and emerging, and also the contribution that Kaurna people have made and continue to make to State Theatre Company of South Australia. A very important part of what we do and the stories that we aim to tell. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks, Kay, for being a really valued supporter of the State Theatre Company South Australia, and I know there are other subscribers in the audience as well, so thank you very much for your support. It's an honour to speak with you. I certainly remember when I was growing up in Berri that many people in the town were Rotarians. Some of them were Lions Club members. I'm not sure what the competition is like there, if it exists at all. But certainly for all of those people, being a Rotarian was a badge of honour where I grew up. I hope you'll bear with me. What I've done today is put together a slideshow of my journey at State Theatre Company South Australia so far, which, as Kay mentioned, is just coming up to its ninth month. But it's been an eventful time, difficult in some ways, tumultuous and unpredictable, but also affirming in many other ways for the support we've seen from the community, from the SA government, from philanthropists, sponsors, and also a time of excitement to come in for me and start working with Mitchell and the whole team and thinking about the future of the organisation in a fluid time when it feels like a lot of things are changing. I would just say, I normally, if I speak, I tend to read too much from notes, so today I'm experimenting with being a bit looser, so bear with me. And also to explain shorts in an otherwise suited room. I decided long ago that if I had to work in Australia during the summer that wearing long pants was just inhumane. And I also abide by the Don Dunstan principle, and he's a great inspiration of ours at State Theatre Company South Australia. So, this is a coronavirus. I'm sure you're all very familiar. But I took this morning to just remind myself of the state of play, if you were, that in the UK there's been 162 deaths per 100,000 people. In the US, 134 deaths per 100,000 people. In the whole of Australia, 4 deaths per 100,000 people. And in South Australia, less than 1 case per 100,000 people and only 4 deaths overall. And there's this interesting statistic on the SA Health website that measures emergency direction compliance checks. There's been 195,000 compliance checks, personal compliance checks in South Australia, and 188,000 of them are compliant. So we're a highly compliant society, and I think that in a way has had an impact on how successful we've been. Globally, theatres have proven remarkably resilient to transmission of coronavirus. In South Korea, where theatres have remained open for the significant majority of the pandemic with temperature checks and masks at 100% capacity, there's been no evidence of transmission at all. I saw a study this morning that suggested there was very little evidence of transmission in cinemas or theatres around the world, but I didn't have time enough to investigate its methodology enough to quote it directly here. And of course in Australia we've been able to exploit that theatres are very controlled environments to make sure that we can manage the way that people attend it and ensure that we've got excellent contact tracing and methodologies in place. I was in KC when the coronavirus shutdown took place. I'd been working for 3 years as the Executive Director of the Blue Room Theatre, which is a great place, a great kind of foundational and totemic small theatre space in Perth. It's 30 years old and was modelled on Melbourne's La Mama Theatre, which is 50 years old, to support independent artists to create their own work by providing them with resources and the venue space for free. And that was a great time, it was a great opportunity, but I suspected I wanted to come back to South Australia for family reasons, and in fact the job as Executive Director at State Theatre was one that I'd kind of had my eye on for a while. So the recruitment process took place for me between January and February in this year and was on its way to being finalised in early March when the shutdown happened. And because State Theatre is a statutory authority, my employment had to be signed off at a Chief Executive level in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. And of course the whole SA government got diverted to managing COVID. So though I had lots of assurances about my employment, I had to resign my previous job without a formal contract and hope I could get across the border. So I think it was a couple of days before I was due to leave, I got my contract of employment, got in a hire car and just headed for the border. And at that stage, Western Australia had intrastate borders in place. So I think I had 4 police checks between Perth and Adelaide. Fortunately, at every one they just kind of waved me through, which was nice. But there was probably like 5 cars that I saw driving between Norseman at the Western Australian end of the Nullarbor Plain and Ceduna at this end, and otherwise it was just trucks. And all the service stations were only open for like 2 hours per day so that you could hop between service stations. Anyway, it was a pretty interesting drive. So when I got to the company, there was no one in the office. This was the middle of May. Everyone was working from home except for our set construction workshop. So the State Theatre Company has an office at the Lion Arts Factory next to the Jam Factory on North Terrace, and then we have our set construction and costume workshop on Port Road, Theberton. Our workshop staff were still coming in and making sets. There's about 9 tradespeople who work down there, and the rest of us were from home. And the arts industry at that time was really struggling with what to do in the face of the shutdown, or everything had obviously, all the theatres had obviously been completely shut down. The SA government responded really proactively and decisively in a good way and created $100,000 emergency response grants. So we were fortunate to pitch for one of those and were successful in getting funding to deliver a project called Decameron 2.0. It was a really ambitious project. It cooked up between Mitchell, Act Now Theatre, who are another local company, and local playwright Emily Steele. We aimed and proposed to make 100 short films over 10 weeks and screen them in episodes of 10 each week for those 10 weeks. Over that time we employed 98 individual artists with that money, which was replacing some of the employment that people had lost. I had friends certainly who were artists who had 6 months of work cancelled overnight. through that March to June period in last year, people were just losing tours and other kinds of gigs. It felt very precarious there for a while. So providing employment to 98 artists at that time was really important, but the project was also a huge artistic success. We managed to work with a whole lot of First Nations and culturally diverse artists, artists with disability that don't normally have access to the company necessarily, because on main stage shows, obviously, we need to work with people who are generally more experienced, and obviously our cast sizes don't stretch to 98. We wish they did. It was hailed really around Australia as probably the most sophisticated and rigorous artistic response to COVID. There were a lot of online theatre projects across that time, but ours had a dimension of quality in its execution that was hailed throughout the industry, and it was a great source of pride for the company and what we could achieve. Just between us, we're now working towards publishing the monologues with another organisation in Australia that we hope will happen this year. It's now been viewed nearly 15,000 times since the first episode was uploaded at the end of July last year. So this was some of the film. We did the filming down at our workshop space on Port Road, so this was one of the filming sessions. And this was another of the filming sessions, so we didn't expect everyone to learn their lines. They could read it off a screen there, you see. So I just wanted to share this photo of the staff at State Theatre Company. As I said, I started in May. This was one of the first times that I didn't meet, apart from Mitchell, another staff member, until well into June. And then, so we started to plan for this Christmas in July celebration in July once we knew that people could come back to work. And I kind of really valued this day. It was because we had just, 2 days earlier, we had been able to tell the staff that we would be resuming live performance by putting Gaslight on at Her Majesty's Theatre. That morning, the new branding got put in at the Lion Arts Factory office, and we were all able, after all of these months, to come together in a way that felt like perhaps it was the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, at least. We got a little merry that day. So, as I said, in that first week of July, I was able to confirm to the team that we'd be able to go back to doing shows, starting with our production of Gaslight, which is a 1939 play by Patrick Hamilton. Hopefully some good number of people in the room got to see it. It was already programmed in our 2020 season, and fortunately it was the next show scheduled when we were able to move from the Playhouse into Her Majesty's Theatre. So the AFC obviously were scheduling the completion of the renovation of Her Majesty's Theatre, and they had a lot of activity planned around that reopening. And then their ambition for that space was and is to host a lot of touring productions, and of course that all just disappeared overnight. So we were scheduled to have Gaslight in the Playhouse, which has a capacity of about 550 to 90 people, and we were going to be doing it at 50%, which would have been 280 people. And the Festival Centre Trust very generously said, well, there's nothing now happening in Her Majesty's Theatre, and if we're playing in there at 50% capacity, that's nearly 700 people. So that was a really wonderful offer by them in the spirit of collaboration. It meant that we sold out that production even at its higher capacity before we even previewed. Which is kind of unheard of in the last several years for State Theatre Company, so that's wonderful. And fortunately, it was a really good show. So no one was disappointed with having booked in advance. But one of the points I wanted to make about that was, at the time there was a lot of surveying going on. Will people want to come back to the theatre? And a lot of those survey responses were coming back with only 29% of people are prepared to come back, and these kinds of scary figures. And actually what we saw once the tickets were on sale was that people flocked back and couldn't wait. And that was certainly people expressed to us that they needed it to feel safe and comply with the regulations, obviously, but provided those things were in place, they felt safe coming back. I just put this in because I got to speak at the pre-opening night function. That was the first time I kind of spoke publicly in this position for the State Theatre Company, and it meant a lot to me. And what I was excited to say on that night to a room full of our closest supporters was that the State Theatre Company of South Australia belongs to everyone in the state. It's all of our right and all of our privilege to share, and that Mitchell and I have a great ambition for the company, and we want people to feel invested in that ambition. We're doing some excellent work already, I think, in the shows that we've been putting on through the end of 2020, and we've also taken that time over the course of the second half of last year to really start to coalesce a vision around the company, which I look forward to coming back and talking to you about at some point in the future. These are production shots from Gaslight. So I often think, oh, how fortuitous that it was Gaslight that went into Her Majesty's, because it just sat so beautifully in the space. It's a period piece, kind of ornate and elaborate production values and design elements. I'm not sure how. There was something about the grandeur or the opulence of the set sat really well in that space, in a way that was just very fortuitous. We did expand it a little bit, but it was basically what we'd planned for the Playhouse. This is just my favourite production shot from that show. This is a local performer named Ksenia Logos who just smashed it out of the park in the lead role in that production. So shortly after that, we launched our 2021 season, also at Her Majesty's Theatre, thankfully. And I guess I wanted, felt like another one of the kind of pinch points around the second half of last year, and the way that we had to navigate our way through COVID, because of course, though we launched in mid to late October, the process of putting the season together really takes place, well, we're doing 2022 now, for example, and so there was a lot of conversation and a lot of consternation about how you would plan forward for 2021. In that instance, the outlook was even more uncertain than it is now. And we were having weekly Zoom conversations with our interstate counterparts. Melbourne was in the middle of its brutal lockdown. We made a decision fairly on that we would aim to make things feel as normal as we could, because we felt that was important for the audience to have confidence about coming back to the theatre and having confidence about the presence of state theatre in their lives, and that we would do that according to the conditions that were prevailing at the time. There's still uncertainty, but we don't regret that approach, and we're kind of managing the restrictions as we go along. If you do come to this year's launch, Mitchell always does a little ditty at the end, and it's a truly great time. And then we finished the end of last year with Ripcord, which was this fantastic contemporary American comedy that Nancy Hayes and Carmel Johnson came over for. It was the biggest set that State Theatre Company has constructed in years. The workshop staff can't recall doing one as big as this for some time. And again, there was something about wanting to do something expansive in a time of uncertainty that was behind some of our decision making around that show. Unfortunately, that one fell right over the 6-day, reduced to 3-day lockdown. And we had talked amongst ourselves and with the board about, okay, what's the worst scenario in the current climate? One of them is of course that you would get the virus amongst the cast. That's actually probably the biggest risk, because if you lose a cast member, they have to go 3 days into isolation. You lose 3 days of performances or rehearsals or something like that. But the second worst scenario was that you would get shut down after your previews but before your opening night, because you've spent everything on the show that you need to spend. You can't get any of that money back. You have to pay the performers all out of their contracts, as you should. And yet you're just refunding tickets. Like, we refunded $44,000 worth of tickets on this show. And that's what happened. It shut down. We had one preview to go before our opening night when the 6-day lockdown occurred. So we had to cancel 1 week, and then we resumed it at one point where that was 75 people in the Dunstan Playhouse, so 75 people in a 550-seat venue. It was a frigid atmosphere. But the cast coped incredibly admirably. Once the lockdown ended, we started to get them back into the theatre to just run the show and feel comfortable. And then we started back at 75, and again, thanks to collaboration with the Festival Centre, we extended by a week to move people from the cancelled shows into the extension. I guess the horrible thing about that was inconveniencing people, but I must say audiences have been very understanding about that kind of necessity. I guess I just wanted to close by quickly, I guess, indicate these are the kinds of thoughts and questions that I have occurred to me or still occur to me about this, and I guess through it all, you really instinctively go to a position where, of course, of course, health and life comes first. It just, that this kind of been behind everything that you do, and that kicks in very instinctively. Cohesive communities are really valuable in wide-scale emergency responses, and we really rely, when we put shows back on people observing the restrictions that you put in place. I really think and hope that the last year can be a turning point in how we think and talk about the arts in Australia. I think the arts were already under severe stress before COVID, and I think there's a big opportunity here to re-engage with the purpose that it serves in all of our psychological well-being and social cohesion. And I guess the second to last point is perhaps one I think about as well, is that when something like this happens, you immediately realise just how precarious the arts workforce is. We employ about 25 people inside the company, but nearly every artist, designer, director that we employ is a casual employee with high degrees of employment insecurity, and it's something that we don't talk about enough, in my opinion. And just to say, I brought along a bunch of these brochures today. Season 2021 is really, really great. We're starting, our first show back is an Adelaide Festival show starting at the end of February called The Boy Who Talked to Dogs, which is going to be great, directed by Andy Packer from Slingsby. So please come and support us, please subscribe if you can, come along to shows, it'll be great to see you all there.
Thanks, Julian. Now, does anyone have any questions?
Not so much a question, but a thank you for guiding State through a very difficult period last year. I think it was fortuitous that Gaslight played at Her Majesty's. It was a marvellous production. You did a great job. My wife and I have been subscribers for many, many years, and you kept us informed at all points. We knew exactly what was happening, and we did enjoy what we saw.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Any other questions? Peter?
Thank you. Great comments just made. It's often said that the arts and the theatre in particular operates on a certain rhythm. Recycling, refreshment, regeneration, new ideas, people coming, people going, and that keeps the whole thing bubbling along. Which begs the question, COVID's not going to stop soon. If we think there's another year, probably another 2 years before we're really out of the COVID, what sort of impacts in your list of questions, what sort of impacts on the rhythm of life of the theatre do you think that's going to have?
Hopefully minimal ones.
Optimist.
Look, there's a lot of practical things that we already talk about, like do we need to employ understudies on every show that we have, for example. Now, a lot of those things involve expense that we can't cover, so we have to really think through those things. I think it probably depends as much on the audience as it does on what we plan to do. It's about people's confidence and people's demand. So if people wanted more theatre, we would probably put more theatre on. I actually think that we could move to 100% capacities at some point during the course of this year. Queensland is, other jurisdictions are. So under those circumstances, what you're really planning for is the cluster outbreak, and that's what you can't kind of predict. Fortunately, the government, for statutory authorities, has extended or relaxed the SACORP's insurance coverage to cover costs relating to things you have to put in place for COVID or box office losses. So those $44,000 worth of ticket refunds we would get back. So as a statutory authority, hopefully the rhythm is not too disrupted. The disruption, if it were to continue into 2022, I think that's where you'd see lots of big problems, and it would probably be especially for companies that aren't aligned to the government and don't have access to that kind of underpinning. But even, I mean, look at the festival and what they've had to do this year. I mean, that's a significant impact. I guess other states like Western Australia put in a guarantee against loss scheme, which is effectively in some ways what the South Australian government has done in that SACORP example. But I think the federal government would have to do more if it continues beyond this kind of immunisation period through to October. I think the federal government would probably need to do more than they currently have.
Thanks, Julian. we hand out this certificate of appreciation to you for addressing our weekly meeting. A donation will be made on your behalf to mitigate and contain the COVID-19 pandemic and to support efforts to eradicate polio worldwide. That's our big eradication polio Rotary. I'd just like to say, in thanking Julian, that State Theatre... Oh, sorry, I've got one more question. Sorry, Roy, we'll give it to you.
It's not a question. For the first time, I've been able to hear everything that was said. For some reason, up till today, the sound men who are organising the sound have got it wrong. At last, it's perfect.
That is wonderful. So I just encourage everyone to take a booklet and to book for the State Theatre. And I'm really pleased that the auditoriums will be full again, because there are so many people who want to sit next to the person they went with. And I feel sorry for the staff having to separate them. Thanks, Julian.